Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. I'm Gabby on the South Pole marketing team and I'll be behind the scenes moderating today's webinar. While we wait for everyone to join, I'll just go through some quick housekeeping. So you're all on mute at the moment as attendees, and if you have a question or comment, please submit it through the question box on your control panel. If you experience any technical difficulties, please let us know and we'll do our best to support you. We'll aim to answer your questions on the presentation in the Q&A at the end, but we do have a limited amount of time and quite a few registrants, so apologies in advance for any that we might miss. This webinar is being recorded and we'll send it to you after the webinar with a link to download the presentation slides, probably within the week. And last but not least, many of us are broadcasting from our homes, so please just bear with us in case there are any technical hiccups, and we'll do our best to resolve those as soon as possible if it happens. So today I'm joined in our South Pole Sydney office by Tom, and before we introduce our other guest speakers, I'd just like to begin today's climate chatter by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which Tom and I are meeting today, and that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this meeting webinar. I pay my respects to elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. Okay, so I'll now hand things over to Tom, our host for today, to introduce the rest of our panel for today's climate chatter. Take it away, Tom.
Thank you, Gabby, and thank you everyone for joining us for our webinar on the road to net zero with Decarbonisation Pathways today. It is my pleasure to welcome you as well. Let me start off by introducing our wonderful speakers. First off, we start with Polly. She will speak about climate active and the role climate neutrality has as part of a sensible decarbonisation strategy. Polly leads the communications and engagement of the Australian government's Climate Active initiative. Polly's roles throughout her career have been diverse, spanning from academic publishing to teaching in remote Indigenous communities to science communications. She has been working in communications for over 10 years in both the public and not-for-profit sectors. She specializes in authentic, purpose-driven communications that build trust and encourage social change, with a particular interest in accelerating consumer uptake of low-carbon solutions. Welcome, Polly. Next up, we have Charlie joining us from beautiful Edinburgh in Scotland. He will explore the definitions of net zero and why this is important. Charlie leads South Pole's corporate climate strategies practice with a team of over 40 consultants around the world. He has over 20 years of experience working with corporates to set their climate change ambitions and take action to reduce climate impacts. This includes manufacturing, high-tech, real estate, and renewable energy sectors. He has also developed agroforestry projects in Africa and seen how they can not only absorb carbon, but also improve the livelihoods and health of smallholder farmers and contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. Next up, we have Shanti, who's joining us from Sydney's Northern Beaches, or actually from the Ecovantage head office in the CBD. As part of giving a practical example to a holistic decarbonisation strategy, Shanti will introduce and give some examples about how energy efficiency can help you save energy, money, and help the planet. Shanti leads business development for Ecovantage in New South Wales, creating strong relationships with key industry partners, authorities, and other industry associations. Shanti previously worked in land and environmental restoration for 7 years and has been working in energy efficiency for the last 2. Shanti's passion is to do everything within his power to embody the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share. So let me kick off by giving you a quick overview of South Pole as the hosts. South Pole is a leading provider of global climate change solutions and services with more than 350 experts across 19 offices worldwide. Our purpose is to act today for a better tomorrow. South Pole is a profit-for-purpose company, and it was founded in 2006. Our expertise covers project and technology finance, data and advisory on sustainability risks and opportunities, as well as the development of environmental commodities such as carbon and renewable energy credits. We take our clients, both private and the public sector, along what we call the climate journey, which focuses on how they can take action and reduce their environmental impacts. As part of this journey, South Pole has a range of climate neutral labels that are compliant with the British Standard Institute's PAS 2060 standard. These are for organizations, products, events, sites, and some other categories. So let me just set the scene here a little bit. On this slide, you see the country overshoot day, which provides an overview of the day when the planet's resources would be all used up if the whole world's population lived like that of a selected country in terms of energy use, diet, and travel. For Australia, this would just be the end of the first quarter. On March 30, we would actually overshoot the planet's resources if everybody lived like an Australian. If everybody lived like an Indonesian, that would be December 18th, so almost covering the whole year. I think this year Earth Overshoot Day was some point in August, and it was actually a little bit later in the year compared to last year because of COVID. I guess we all know it. So yeah, there's a lot of talk about reducing emissions, planetary boundaries, Earth Overshoot Day, setting targets, and decarbonizing. We want to shed some light on these topics, what they stand for, how they're connected, and what they mean for you. Please join me for the next hour to get some answers on these questions from our experts, and stay around for an inspiring Q&A session, to which we're of course counting on your questions. Kicking things off will be Polly from Climate Active, the Climate Active presenting the program. She will then hand over to Charlie. After his part, he'll pass on to Shanti. Polly, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you so much to everyone who's made the time to join the session today. As Tom says, and as the slide says, I'm from Climate Active. Very broadly, we guide and certify voluntary carbon neutrality by Australian organisations. We've been around since about 2010. We were formerly known as the National Carbon Offset Standard, which you may be familiar with, but we recently rebranded as this latest iteration in a way that's a bit more emotive and accessible. So I've got a fairly small window today, but I want to try and make it as useful as possible for you. Many of you may already be carbon neutral and possibly even climate active members, but I don't want to make that assumption. So I just want to quickly outline the concepts underpinning carbon neutrality and mention how carbon neutrality complements as opposed to undermines ambitious decarbonisation strategies. Then if I've got time, I'll just give you a quick outline of how you would go about being certified by us if that was something you're interested in. So as I said, Climate Active is a framework for achieving rigorous carbon neutrality. We've got a carbon neutral standard that's free for anyone to use. That's those coloured boxes up the top there. It guides and gives you best practice for how to reach carbon neutrality. We also provide carbon neutral certification to people who've used that standard. So once you've met all of our requirements and paid us a licence fee, your business is able to use the Climate Active trademark to promote itself as taking climate action. I think there might be a bit of a lag on the slides, and I apologise. So in a nutshell, this is the process a business would go through to be carbon neutral. You calculate, reduce, and then offset your emissions, including your Scope 3 emissions. There's no ownership over the term or the concept of carbon neutrality, and there are slight variations in the definition. So there's a couple of misconceptions around carbon neutrality as it pertains to us, which I think are important to mention in the context of today's discussion. The first is that there's often the assumption that there's no reduction requirement to achieve carbon neutrality and that the emphasis is purely on offsetting. And this actually isn't the case. While we're a voluntary program and we can't mandate reductions, our program is set up to reward decarbonisation. Our fees are calculated according to footprint, and obviously the smaller your carbon footprint is, the less you spend on offsets at the end of the process. We also require our members to publicly report every year on their carbon neutrality in a public disclosure statement, and a key part of that is outlining your emissions reduction strategies. There's also a bit of a misconception that carbon neutrality is only about carbon. If you're using our framework, your inventory must include all GHG emissions. So just, I guess, back to the topic, as many people have said, 2020 was meant to be the year of climate action. The end of last year, we saw a huge surge in climate action declarations by cities and businesses. And actually, in spite of COVID, the momentum has only continued into this year. Microsoft committed to jump from carbon neutrality to carbon negativity. Last year, Amazon co-founded a climate pledge. 500 B Corps committed to net zero at the end of last year. And I guess this is fantastic, but the question I have is, how do we get from the status quo to meeting these ambitions? So what's the pathway? I'm particularly interested in those businesses such as IKEA and Unilever and Microsoft, who are saying they're now going to be climate positive. A large part of Microsoft's plan is to retrospectively remove the carbon they've generated since, I think it's 1975, which you may be aware of. They've got a $1 billion fund for developing the technology to do this, negative emissions technology, which is technology that doesn't actually exist yet. So a lot of that technology doesn't exist. A lot of the technology to reach net zero does exist, as Shanti will touch on, but a lot of it doesn't. And currently it's also expensive. And this is realistically going to affect a business's ability to be able to adopt it, especially in light of the pandemic and the financial situation we find ourselves in. So in a Deloitte survey, I think it was last year, of around 2,000 executives across the world about business preparedness for the disruption of climate change, 83% of business leaders said it was their generation's responsibility to address climate change. In the same survey, though, only half as many of those leaders said they were actually prepared to invest in technologies to counteract the disruption of climate change. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it's admirable to set a target, and it's what everyone should be doing. But realistically, getting to net zero by something like 2030 or 2025, or whatever date you want to put, is currently difficult, and it's highly dependent on specific business operating environments. In the status quo, it's quite hard for businesses to map out a clear pathway beyond setting that target. So this is where I want to talk about carbon neutrality, specifically the offsetting aspect. And I think this is what Thomas and Southpole are alluding to by saying that carbon neutrality is the starting point. So total decarbonisation is where we want to be. There's no doubt about that. But if a business has articulated a commitment to zero emissions, but doesn't have the wherewithal currently to be investing in technology or renewables right now, then at the very least, they should be offsetting their emissions. And offsets are a credible and legitimate way for any business to reach net zero right now. So what this might look like for a business while waiting for some of those negative emissions technology is to use a mix of reduction mechanisms that are listed in that slide. So that might be renewable energy, green power, utilising a low emission supply chain, changing behavioural practices in the workplace, coupled with a high quality offset portfolio. And this is something a business can do within a year. And then as you progress, the ratio of these will change. So in the first instance, you might just switch to green power to bring your electricity emissions down. And the next year, you might start installing your solar PV. And as you reduce your emissions, you slowly decrease your reliance on offsets. But I think the key thing is that you're taking responsibility for your emissions all the way through. And in fact, I would say a majority of businesses certified by Climate Active are taking this approach. They're taking responsibility for their emissions now by using offsets while they implement a longer term decarbonisation plan. And as I said, as part of their certification, they're required to disclose on what this plan is. So just a note on offsets, they're not all created equal. As the previous slide indicates, there's only certain types of offsets that we accept under our standard. And these offsets must meet certain integrity criteria that are listed there. These principles are outlined in more detail in our standard, or else Southpole can give you more guidance on what these are. They know the standard inside out. So I think I've got, I'm sorry, I haven't kept track of time. I think I've got a couple of minutes. So I'll just quickly outline in what is involved in being certified by us. The first thing is to establish your emissions boundary. For most people here, I would imagine that will be your business operations. We also have a standard and provide certification for products and services, events, buildings and precincts. Then you enter a license agreement with us, which is basically the terms and conditions, the use of the trademark, fee schedule, reporting schedule, and your validation schedule. Then you calculate all your emissions. I think, as I said before, that's for scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. And your carbon account must be developed according to best practice carbon accounting principles, which include relevance, transparency, consistency, accuracy, and completedness. So once you've got your carbon account, you identify where you can make reductions and implement your reduction strategy, and obviously any remaining emissions you offset. So you then have to have your carbon neutral claim verified by a third-party auditor and submitted to us. And if we give you the tick, then you're certified, you publish your boundary, methodology, inventory, and proof of offsetting on our website. And in order to maintain this certification, you carry out these steps every year and pay an annual fee. I think with the exception of independent validation, that's carried out every 3 years. So this is really just a shameless plug for Climate Active. I updated this slide about 2 weeks ago and it's already out of date. The initiative's growing at an unprecedented rate. I think the last couple of years we've been seeing growth of 50% each year, and we're receiving several inquiries every day about certification. We recently certified Telstra, and one of their daughter brands Belong as Australia's first carbon neutral telco. We've got Australia's first carbon neutral homes, residential homes, carbon neutral wine, banks. We've got this beautiful diversity of members across a range of sectors, and we're, I guess, kind of working towards this low carbon economy or ecosystem, really. And that's just an indication of the growth that we've seen. You can see from where we've launched how quickly we've grown and what our projected growth is as well. We're also seeing our trademark being used more commonly and prominently on products and member collateral. So part of the new iteration of our certification is to bring consumers into the story, because it's fantastic that businesses are taking action, but it's also really important to make people aware of it and to make people care. And then you start to bring, it's sort of you get this virtuous circle happening. So the more consumers are aware, the more they start to seek out carbon neutral brands, and that's a driver for certification too. Another shameless plug. So beyond a really rigorous and independently verified carbon neutral claim, we want to make sure our members are equipped to promote their achievement, because it is a significant achievement. It does take time and does take work. And so we make sure that we promote our members and try to give them the tools that they need to be able to promote themselves. I think I might have run out of time there, so I'm going to hand over to Charlie. I just wanted to mention, if you've got any questions, I think there's you can enter them in the chat and then we'll get to them after the conversation.
Holly, thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining. I'm Charles Henderson, and as Tom introduced, I lead South Pole's climate strategies practice. We're 40 consultants around the world helping corporates along their net zero journey. And it is one of the fastest growing themes that we're experiencing, net zero, when we're working with these corporates. And it certainly ties into, we've noticed it tying into other mega trends, and this is the rationale behind which businesses are making these commitments. First one is investor focus on resilience and sustainability, and of course that's been accelerated by the COVID crisis. There's the political focus on Build Back Better and talk in many regions of a Green New Deal. And then there's the public awareness and the cultural shift in perceptions around climate change. And all of these issues are putting kind of increased pressure on corporates to take a long-term position on climate change for two reasons. First of all, to de-risk into the future, and then also to seize the opportunities of the transition to a low-carbon economy. And here are some indications which kind of reflect what Polly was saying about this 50% growth year on year. I mean, it is pretty much going exponential at the moment. So a couple of points to call out. We're close at the moment to 1,500 major corporates signing up to both science-based targets. That's a commitment to reduce in line with what the science dictates to meet a 1.5 or a 2 degree warming trajectory. And then also the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that's disclosures in line with a framework developed by the investor community to the investment community, effectively feeding the information they need to see about how business is prepared to tackle climate change into the future. And if we were to continue on this growth year on year, we'll have by 2025, we'll have a five-fold increase in the number of businesses globally who've made these commitments to over 11,000, and generally these are major corporates. Net zero is a more recent agenda, and we're going to look into what that means, and a few of the businesses that have made these pledges, and look at the intricacies of what how businesses are going about tackling it. So let's think about why net zero. Let's take a little step back and think about why it's important. We are, under the Paris Agreement, facing a huge ambition gap. If we sum up all of the pledges made by national governments under the Paris Agreement, represented at the top by the sort of the light grey bar, we're very far away from the decarbonisation pathways that are required to keep global warming to 2 degrees. That's the yellow. Not to mention 1.5 compatible green curve, which is the one at the bottom, and that's actually a doubling of the reduction trajectory from 2 degrees. So that means that those businesses and the investors and the cities and national governments who are really concerned and committed about climate change, they effectively have to compensate for the the lack of ambition of others and double down on their commitments. But thankfully, there is a very strong business case for doing so. And this data is out of, unfortunately, it's out of date. It's based on most recent figures that we could access. The number of companies that are referring to strategies to neutralize our impacts on the climate, they've been growing in the past few years. But what we've seen is that the terms of carbon neutrality and climate neutrality and increasingly net zero, they're quite often being used interchangeably and inconsistently. But what we can do is we can sort of try and untangle that jargon and look at the different steps that may be taken. And what's in it for businesses to safeguard their reputation, their exposure to these policy and carbon pricing risks coming down the track or already in existence in certain regions, increase their investability and share price. And there is a correlation between sustainable thinking and the agenda and actual action and share price, and good governance, and that of course increases resilience. There's a correlation between businesses that have taken COVID seriously and prepared for it, and those that have sort of mechanisms in place to manage sustainability agenda. And also these businesses are accelerating innovation and their competitive advantage against others. Apple, for example, it's secured vast amounts of renewable energy and is tackling the greenhouse gases it emits in its value chain. And it has overachieved so far. But in contrast, you look at ThyssenKrupp, steelmaker. It has made far-reaching commitments to net zero, and yet, by 2050, and yet there isn't a whole-scale there isn't a technology that's available for whole-scale transformation of that sector yet. So that makes it significant in that respect. And there's others like Unilever who you could apply the similar logic to. But they're tackling step by step different products and parts of their value chain, their supply chain and manufacturing to reduce emissions. And interestingly, Microsoft and Velux, they're going lifetime net zero. And the question arises, how's the ambition bar going to rise beyond this? And really you could imagine businesses taking more stretching commitments and reducing the timeframes over what they'll do them. Thank you. Now we can move on to the next one. So let's consider what net zero means. First thing to say is there's no standard industry definition. This is a work in progress, and South Pole, we've been contributing to that conversation and that debate. And I'll explain the way that we see it currently at South Pole. There is a strict definition by the IPCC, which has used the term net zero in its most recent reports, but it very much sees it as a target destination into the future, at which point emissions equal removals. And 2050 is a stated goal for net zero globally. But when you're thinking about corporates and their activities and their steps they take to achieve net zero, there's no one size fits all. And it's safe to say that to achieve it on this global level, we have to attack the problem from both ends. We have to dramatically decrease our emissions, but also ramp up the carbon sinks to absorb carbon dioxide. And there's three ways that companies can support this goal: by reducing, avoiding, and removing emissions. So first of all, reductions. Businesses need to take ambitious long-term, set themselves long-term reduction strategies, ideally aligned with science, through energy efficiency, switching to renewable energy, and targeting their supply chain, and also innovating in their products and services to avoid emissions. Then they can also invest, or they should also invest in avoided emission reductions credits, which means financing mitigation activities that contribute to sustainable development. For example, through protecting vital rainforests from deforestation, but also recognizing that that isn't going to be the whole picture, because we don't have enough land, and that competes potentially with agriculture in some areas. So, which means that we also need to build the necessary infrastructure for low carbon economies through technology. And removals, carbon sinks represent, the chance to balance out those avoidable emissions and reach net zero. And that's planting trees, but again, that's limited potentially by land area, and hence carbon capture and storage is necessary. And investment is needed now to scale this by the mid-century. So let's have a look at what these three elements mean if you add them all together. These three ingredients. The grey dotted line at the top, that represents business as usual, emissions by, let's say, a hypothetical company. As a first measure, the company can reduce its emissions, which takes time to stabilize, and that's why this green dotted line kind of curves. It stabilizes first, and then it reduces. And then at the same time, the company must start to compensate by investing in these avoidance and these removal credits to balance out the remaining residual emissions. And in this scenario, a business achieves net zero by 2050. But of course, we would encourage businesses, and you'll have seen, those examples I showed earlier, of those businesses that have aimed for a more aggressive net zero ambition. And of course, that would always be encouraged. And I would expect that businesses, even if they set a 2050 goal now, will aim for a more immediate time frame into the future. And the climate definitely needs this, and expectations are rising fast in all of the stakeholder groups: investors, customers, employees, and so on. So to sum up, net zero, it's very much a process, and there is no one size fits all answer to it, and it's unique to every company. And working towards net zero is how companies can unify their ongoing efforts under a sort of single initiative and reevaluate the ambition of their existing targets. If they're, for example, just tackle reductions through renewable energy, or that's where they put their emphasis. In our view at South Pole, what's particularly important is that net zero targets, they're transparent, ambitious, they're anchored in science, and they support, and the credits are verified, and they conform to the standards that Polly mentioned, but also they support the Sustainable Development Agenda, and that's particularly important to get the co-benefits of investing in a low carbon So now I'll wrap up there. Very happy to take questions later. Post those in the chat box. Now I'm going to pass over to Shanti from our partners at Ecovantage.
Thanks very much, Charles, and thank you very much for Polly for sort of providing a broader frame of reference for carbon neutrality. Both South Pole and Climate Active have given a bit more of that sort of broader perspective. What I'm going to do here with my presentation is give a little bit more of the practical and how you can influence your greenhouse gas emissions in your business. Energy efficiency will help you save money. It will reduce the amount of resources you're using. It will reduce greenhouse gases, and it will benefit your business and benefit the planet. I'm going to go through a couple of examples and showing exactly how this has benefited some of our clients. Next slide, please. Energy efficiency, as you can see in this picture, is sometimes kind of shunted off to the side. We're sometimes treated like the unpopular kid. We don't have that sort of those gravitas or the sexiness of solar or renewables or climate neutrality, which are all the buzz. But energy efficiency, it forms the basis. It forms the base for the structure of the others, because you need energy efficiency. You need to reduce how many greenhouse gases that you are putting out there and how much energy you're using to then bring in those renewables. Next slide, please. So a lot of us think about energy efficiency. We hear when we're kids, we might have heard a carer yell out, turn off the lights, or take a shorter shower, or turn off the heater or the air conditioner. The problem with this is energy conservation, so this is saving energy, but this is taking away from a service that we might rely upon. If you turn off the light, you might not be able to study. You might not be able to play the piano. You might not be able to read. If you turn off that heater, you don't want to clog yourself up with like all of your jackets and put all of your blankets on. It takes away from that service. Energy efficiency is not about taking away from that service. Energy efficiency is using the same electrical appliances. Maybe you can reduce your usage of those, but using ones that are more efficient and that will last longer and that provide the same service but not use as much energy. Next slide, please. So I'm going to run through a pretty relatable example here where we're looking at a house, and on this graph on the left we can see this is a bit of an older style house. This is based in Melbourne in Victoria, Australia, and they start off with around so they're using around 60 megajoules of energy per day. So they go through that process step by step of reducing their emissions by upgrading appliances, by changing their lights, by changing to a more energy efficient cooling or adding insulation. And at the end of that journey of energy efficiency, they've reduced their energy use by 75%. So we're going from a house that to go off grid, you would need 60 panels and a whopping cost of around $15,000. That's best case scenario, by the way. That's if you've got a 30-degree slope on your roof and you've got sunny days and no shading. Whereas with this other side, where we've gone through the energy efficiency journey, we're looking at a house where we only need 16 panels and a more affordable $5,000. Now, businesses and commercial enterprises are obviously different from our houses. They have different energy needs. And on this graph on the right, I've nominated lighting first because that's the lowest hanging fruit. Even though we've got HVAC, which is for your heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, I've nominated lighting because that's the quickest and the easiest to tackle, and it's probably the lowest capital outlay. Next slide, please. So every unit that we're saving of energy, when we reduce how much energy we're using, so we're saving, so if we save 1 unit at the workplace or at our home, we're saving 3 to 10 units at the plant. And as most of our electricity is coming from coal and oil and gas, I think we're saving those resources being extracted and those resources being burned and used. This case study here that I have is one of our customers, and this is just one site that we did an upgrade on. So we've done multiple of their sites. CHEP is an international company and they make pallets, and this is just for one of their warehouses. At this site, we were able to reduce their energy, their lighting energy, by 70% by upgrading all of their lights to LED energy efficient lighting. LED lights are between 50 and 90% more efficient than their predecessors, and they're a revolution in energy efficiency. So we were able to save this company, just at this one site, $50,000 per year. And after 12 months, which was the initial payback, that was just money that they could put and invest in other things. They could invest in different parts of their business or in their people. Next slide, please. Next up, we have an example, and this is going to be an example of a council. And this is a council in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Most of their costs would be through air conditioning and for energy would be through air conditioning and lighting. And we upgraded around 1,100 lights for these guys. So when you look at it, we saved these guys around $64,000 in energy costs per year. And that's a 74% reduction, which is almost a quarter of what they started with. Because they're a council and they're a government enterprise, they don't have the same rebates available to them, so the payback was a little bit slower. But after that 1.9 years, they're saving this $64,000 per year, which they can invest in parks, in public infrastructure, and a lot more exciting things than paying an electricity bill. Next slide, please. My last example, which is coming up, is a smaller example because not all of us have these larger buildings or larger warehouses. This is a simple supermarket upgrade. This is a refrigeration. We changed the engines in there, or the motors in their refrigerators, and we were able to reduce their energy cost by $14,000 per year just by putting improved and more efficient refrigeration motors. And that reduced their energy by 50%, which is massive. It was a 10-month payback period, so it meant that they could invest in other things, in other energy efficiency or carbon neutrality, or being registered with Carbon Active. So, you know, these energy efficiencies mean that you can invest your money elsewhere. Next slide, please. On this next slide, I'll just, up the top on the left, we've got what happens when you invest in these industries. So this is an example of investing $10 million in those industries. First of all, we have renewables, the sexy industry, and you get about 75 jobs from that. But if you invest in energy efficiency, we trump that a little bit, we get 77 jobs coming from this. Whereas if you invest in fossil fuels, because it's highly mechanized and there's high wages, very high wages, that you will get less jobs for the money that you invest in it. And I had a little look at who the popular kid is, and a little wiki how look at it. And we're looking at who the popular one is now, because energy efficiency is going to give these payback to your business very quickly. So we've got businesses coming to us and residents coming to us for those paybacks and for those savings. Next slide, please. So what can you do? What can you do straight away? You can visit our landing page, which gives you a few tips. These are free tips. You don't have to do anything. You can just change a few things in your business. And I will show you exactly how you can save some money right now. Then you can go to an assessor. You can get somebody to do an energy assessment. It might be us. You might be in a different country. You might look for somebody else. But find out what's using the most energy in your company or in your household first, and then you can tackle it one after another. I want you to engage with the local schemes, so with the local rebates, because there are rebates and there's schemes that can help you with that initial capital outlay. And last of all, and I think this is one of the most important, is to tackle the low-hanging fruit first. Because some of these bigger investments, maybe your HVAC is quite a large capital investment, but if you tackle the low-hanging fruit of, say, lighting, it's less of an investment, and your payback you'll get within 6 to 12 months, and then you'll have money in the pocket and you'll be able to prove your case. So I'd say tackle the low-hanging fruit first. I'll now hand back to Tom, and if you have any questions, please pop those into the chat.
Thank you, Shanti, and thanks to all the speakers. Those are really some very valuable insights. We will now turn to the Q&A. Right? Yes, exactly. So with regards to the Q&A, let me just start off right with some interesting questions that we received from you, the participants. And yeah, I'll start off with Polly, who also spoke first. Polly, one of the questions for you is, what is the main driver why businesses choose to join the government-administered climate active program over others or self-certifying?
There's a couple of reasons. So the motivation tends to vary across our network, usually depending on the sector or the size of our participants. The biggest driver that we've seen that I think has spurred our organic growth is probably climate risk disclosure. So obviously there's increasing risk of litigation by shareholders, or even we've seen superannuation firms are at risk of being sued by their members if they don't disclose climate risk. So that's a huge driver. Then that's, I guess, the stick side of it. The carrot side is that there's a lot of commercial opportunities in taking climate action. So charging a premium on products. We know that there's a massive market for sustainable products and sustainable brands. Employee retention, purpose is a massive, is a very big driver of you know, quality staff wanting to work at any business. And to answer the second part of the question, which was, what are the benefits of a government-administered program? Is that right, as opposed to self-declaring?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's no rights over the term or the concept of carbon neutrality, which means that anyone can say, you know, oh, I planted some trees in my backyard, therefore I'm carbon neutral. And there's not really anyone, any watchdog, apart from, you know, if you're making really outrageous claims, the ACCC will probably pull you up. But we are the only government administered standard. So we're the only one providing full rigour and transparency. So we've had a lot of members who have been self-declaring for some time, but until they're actually joining, I guess, some sort of rigorous, independently verified framework like ours, there's, you know, they just don't have that rigour when they're self-declaring.
Mm-hmm.
Did that answer the question? Was there any other components to it that I've missed?
No, I think that's fine. Yeah, I think that was very comprehensive. Thanks for that, Polly. Next up, we'll continue with Charlie. There's a question also with regards to understanding of some of the concepts that you introduced and discussed. So the question basically goes, so what essentially is the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero? Is the concept of avoidance versus removal offsets the only one? Also, does net zero include scope 3, or is it a boundary companies can set?
Yeah, it's thanks for that question. It's an important one. Yeah, net zero, as defined by the IPCC, you know, is the ultimate destination. So that is the point at which, you know, we've decarbonized our economies. You know, certain hard to reach sectors have, you know, invested in technologies that have reduced the emissions on site through, you know, through the hydrogen economy, for example. And then what small residual emissions are there have been balanced by, you know, net removals. Carbon neutrality is a term that effectively that demonstrates at a business level balancing emissions with compensated removals and also avoidance. And net zero, as currently sort of used when describing a business, actually kind of effectively means the same thing. And that is why these terms are quite often used interchangeably. But there are a number of task force being, at work to further clarify at a business level what net zero means, what proportion of avoidance versus removals should be allowable to compensate for those emissions beyond the reduction pathway. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, there isn't a strict definition there yet, but certainly at South Pole, we would advocate using both types of credit and adopting a very strict science-based target reduction strategy as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Shanti, a question for you here. So you mentioned that energy efficiency is good practice for all businesses, and you outlined how to get started. With the uptick in interest in climate action over the last year or so, have you also noticed more interest in the topic of energy as part of the broader discussion about climate?
Have we seen an uptake in the interest of energy? Yes, I would say definitely. I mean, a lot of our customers, they come to us because when you do an energy efficiency upgrade, it's going to give you something that is going to reduce your costs, and it's also going to reduce your maintenance. But we do increasingly have customers, and it depends on the size of the business. So if it's a smaller or medium business, they're not coming for that reason. But some of the larger businesses are interested in how they can reduce their carbon footprint. And by going through energy efficiency, like I explained in the slides, that's one of the steps. It's sort of a foundational step. So if you wanted to, say you had a large warehouse, if they want to cover all of their electricity, they need to then firstly reduce how much energy they're using. So we have customers sort of looking at it in that perspective. A lot of the times these decisions are based on costs and capital outlay, but they are also, so it's a sort of a twofer. People are interested in saving money and less maintenance, but they're also interested in what they can do for the climate. So it's a bit of a mixture there.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. So thank you, Shanti. We'll move on to another question for Polly here. If a company gains climate active certification, does this also cover their products and services? And would we be able to claim our products are carbon neutral and our organization is too?
That's a good question. It's up to how you set your boundary, really. So we provide certification for organizations and products and services which are discrete to that. But just say you had a supermarket, for example, that was certified for their business operations. You could potentially cover all your products off in that certification too. What we tend to see more often is two discrete certifications. So a certification for all your business operations, your offices, your staff commute, your waste, electricity and things like that for running your operations, and then choose them certifying, say, one or two products or an entire product line. Of course, it's up to you. Product certification is slightly different. So you have to do a life cycle assessment for your product too. So that's kind of another layer of administration. It means that it's a really rigorous certification, but it does take a bit more time. So you have to, I guess, quantify all the inputs into your product. So you would have probably two separate certifications in that instance, and you would pay for two separate certifications. We do offer a discount on each subsequent certification though. So we have a packaging company, for example, that has its entire range of packaging products certified with us, but they're all very similar products. So they've paid less, and I think once you certify a certain amount, then the subsequent ones are free after a while.
Yeah, I mean, this is also something that I would support from a South Pole perspective. As I said in the beginning, we also have a range of climate neutral labels, as we call them, for different categories. And yes, the best approach here probably would be to tackle these topics separately, but to pursue kind of a common vision. But yeah, if really an organization wants to seek certification, it's something else. When a product seeks certification, but both certainly can be done.
Yeah, so it's sorry to cut you off, Tom. It's often, unless you've got a huge budget, it's probably more realistic to do a staged approach to certification, and it also depends what you're trying to achieve as well. So having a product certified is incredibly powerful because you get to use that trademark on the product. If you've got something that's in the hands of consumers being passed around or on the supermarket shelves, that's pretty good promotion for your organization.
I agree, and this is where there's huge potential also going forward. Let's continue with another question here for Charlie. So you mentioned the climate journey. How can companies get started on this journey, and what's in it for them?
Sure. Okay, so the starting point in step one is a so-called baselining step, where businesses, and it's really the foundation stones of the journey. It is understanding carbon emissions, of course, impact on climate. So doing a carbon footprint, including on-site emissions, bought-in electricity, associated emissions with that, and other energy sources. And then the value chain, so manufacturing, production, and so on. That's one bit. Secondly, we would always encourage a forward-looking, a risk assessment, looking at both the physical and transition risks of climate change as part of step one, because that really helps a business to understand how things are going to look into the future on a couple of potential trajectories, be it a trajectory where we stick to 1.5 degrees and we have a very vibrant low carbon economy, or on the other hand, if the political will isn't there and if enough action isn't taken and we have a warming world, and so we're sort of heading down a 3 or even not a 4 degree trajectory. And then we would also encourage a materiality assessment. So with those bits in place, businesses can start to design a strategy and the targets and the roadmap towards a low carbon future. Sorry, could you just repeat the second part of the question, Tom?
Yes. Well, how can companies get started on the journey, and what's in it for them?
What's in it for them? Okay, so all of those things, contribute to different, they effectively answer stakeholder needs. Investment community in particular is looking for these forward-looking risk assessments that I mentioned and disclosures through TCFD increasingly. Customers are looking to, see that businesses they buy from are, sustainable and that they're, reducing their impacts both societally and, environmentally and societally on the products they generate and manufacture. Employees are increasingly looking to work for green aligned businesses, and the public are demanding it. So it reduces, reputational impacts on the business. So there's a multitude of reasons, but what we're seeing is that these things are all coming together now, and it's almost like the sort of perfect storm of needs and demands from a number of different directions. And that's really what's tipping that sort of exponential growth of businesses embarking on their sustainability journeys and, embarking on the climate change.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. Another question for Shanti here, and I think we might only have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So, Shanti, you mentioned low-hanging fruits for energy efficiency activities. Which activities are least explored that you think have the largest scope for uptake in domestic and commercial sectors?
I think, and I showcased it there, is lighting is probably, and for most cases, it would be case by case. So it depends on the business and what their energy uses are. But for us, and what we see most of the time is lighting is going to be the one that's the easiest to tackle, and it's going to be the one that's going to get you the quickest bang for your buck. HVAC is an excellent way to reduce your energy, so that's heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. So if you can upgrade your air conditioning and those things, that's another really good way to reduce how much energy that you're using, but generally those upgrades are a much larger capital outlay, whereas when you're looking at a lighting upgrade, these are a lot of the times encouraged by governments through schemes, and I'm not sure about every other country, but even without the rebates, they're quite affordable. And then once you've got that, and I say that as the lowest hanging fruit because it's probably the easiest to do. Even in your residence, in your house, if you just change over your bulbs or you change over your lights to LED lighting, you're going to see a significant reduction in your lighting energy, because I think the percentage is about, from a halogen is around 70 to 90% more energy efficient with an LED light. And not only that, is the amount of times that you need to replace those bulbs. They're about, I think, 15 to 25 times. You would have to replace 15 to 25 of those bulbs to equate to one LED. So that, I would say that would probably be your lowest hanging fruit there.
That's a very nice statement. Also, for those of you who have read Paul Hawken's Project Drawdown, otherwise I recommend you look into that. In terms of energy efficiency, when you look at industrial refrigerants, we're actually also tackling the #1 cause of known human solutions to addressing global warming. So if we manage to really define better solutions for industrial refrigerants, or actually apply existing solutions to existing infrastructure, that's the biggest impact we can have in terms of reducing emissions. So I think that was a very nice last word there. So I thank you very much for your expert answers to this Q&A session. All the speakers, thank you for participating, and I hand over to Gabby for some concluding words. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope you found this webinar insightful and helpful. And if you've got any questions for any of our panelists today, please feel free to reach out. All their details are on the screen. And you can check the events section of the South Pole website for upcoming climate chatters and webinars we might be holding around the world. That's southpole.com/events. Otherwise, have a lovely Tuesday afternoon or morning if you are in the UK or Europe like Charlie. Thanks everyone, bye.